The air in the neighborhood always carried a strange kind of silence, the kind that didn't feel peaceful but watchful, like every movement was being noted. It was one of those HOA-controlled communities where everything was neat, almost too neat. The lawns were cut to the same length, mailboxes lined up in perfect order, and paint colors had to be approved by a board of people who believed they owned the right to decide what perfect looked like. At first glance, it looked like a picture of stability. Families walked their kids to school, retirees watered their flowers, and the rules made everything look orderly. But beneath that surface, there was tension, the kind that comes when people live too close, with too many rules, and too much pride at stake. The streets were quiet, almost polished, but the quiet never lasted long. Arguments happened in whispers over trash cans being left out too late or grass growing an inch too high. What looked like harmony from the outside was actually a web of power and control, run by a few residents who treated the HOA not as a community service but as their personal kingdom. One of them, the kind of woman people whispered about but never confronted, held a presence over the place that made others uneasy. She had the sharp eyes of someone who never missed a detail, and the kind of confidence that came with knowing people were afraid of her. In that world lived a young woman who was trying, in her own quiet way, to keep her life steady. She wasn't wealthy, not like most who live behind those manicured hedges, but she was allowed in because she followed the rules and stayed quiet. Her service dog went with her everywhere, steady, calm, trained to pick up on things no one else could see. For her, that dog wasn't just a companion. It was a lifeline. The bond between them was something deep, built on trust and survival, the kind of connection most people wouldn't understand unless they had lived it. On the outside, her days looked ordinary. She took her dog for walks, kept to herself, paid her dues on time, and avoided conflict. But in a place like that, even silence drew attention. It was as if her very existence in that community didn't sit right with certain people, especially the ones who thrived on control. The dog, well-trained and quiet, still seemed to bother them, as though the sight of it was a challenge to the unspoken rules of who belonged and who didn't. The woman from the HOA had a way of watching her, a gaze that lingered too long, as if she was looking for an excuse. It wasn't obvious at first, just little comments, the kind that sound harmless if you repeat them out loud, but carry a bite when you hear them in the moment. Questions about whether the dog was really necessary, reminders about rules that didn't even exist. Notes slipped under the door pointing out small details no one else would care about. It was control disguised as concern, the kind of behavior that felt small but cut deep when repeated over and over. The service dog never reacted, never barked or lunged. It wasn't in its nature. But animals sense things we don't, and there were moments when the dog would freeze, its body tense, as if it felt something its owner couldn't see. Those pauses were warnings in their own way, signals of danger that hadn't revealed itself yet. Neighbors whispered about the woman behind closed doors, but no one said anything out loud. That was the problem in places like this. Everyone saw, everyone knew, but no one wanted to be the one to speak up. The quiet stretched on, tension building like a storm gathering out of sight. Life carried on, but with each passing day, the cracks in that perfect neighborhood grew a little wider. It was only a matter of time before one of those cracks split open. The smallest moment, something that should have been nothing, more than another petty dispute, was about to turn into something that could never be undone. The dog would be caught in the middle. The young woman's life would shift in an instant, and the HOA enforcer who thought she ruled the street would learn that the power she held over neighbors stopped where the law began. But no one knew that yet. For now the lawns stayed green, the houses looked perfect, and the quiet world went on, seconds away from shattering. It started with the small things, the kinds of moments most people would brush off if they didn't add up over time. A door slammed too hard when the young woman passed by with her dog. A sudden silence when she walked into the community gym. Eyes that lingered just long enough to feel sharp, like the neighbors were waiting for her to slip. At first she told herself it was nothing, that she was overthinking. But the longer she lived there, the harder it was to ignore the way the atmosphere around her thickened every time the HOA woman was near. The dog was the first target. It didn't bark, didn't cause trouble, yet complaints started to stack up. "The dog smells," one note read. Another claimed the dog scared children, even though it never so much as raised its voice. Someone left a typed letter taped to her door, outlining service dog fraud and warning that faking a disability was a crime. She read it with shaking hands, heat building in her chest, because the words weren't just cruel, they were false. She needed that dog. Her life without it would fall apart in ways no one could see from the outside. The woman running the HOA knew exactly where to press. She wasn't reckless. She was calculated. She would smile in public, wave at passing cars, and then use the rules as a weapon in private. Every week, another violation slipped into the young woman's mailbox. Grass too tall, trash can not be pulled in on time, dog not registered properly, and parking spot misuse. None of it was true, and every time the woman fought back, she was met with more rules she'd never heard of before. The board, mostly silent men who didn't want to get on the bad side of the self-appointed queen, signed off on everything without question. Still, the young woman tried to endure it. She told herself the best response was to stay calm, to not give this neighbor the satisfaction of a reaction. But calm doesn't last when you feel hunted in your own home. It began to wear her down. Nights grew long, filled with restless thoughts. She would sit in her living room, the dog curled at her feet, listening for footsteps outside. She started to believe that every sound, a car slowing near her house, a knock at a door 2 houses away, was a warning. Things escalated in ways that weren't as easy to ignore. The woman began approaching her in person, no longer satisfied with hidden notes. She would stop her on the sidewalk, arms crossed, voice drippy, on with that mocking sweetness people use when they want to humiliate you in front of others. "Are you sure that's a real service dog?" she asked one morning, loud enough for neighbors on their porches to hear. The young woman's throat tightened, and her dog pressed close to her leg, steadying her. She walked away, refusing to answer, but the sound of quiet laughter followed her. The HOA queen fed on control, but what she really fed on was fear. The more rattled her target became, the stronger she felt, and she was clever enough to mix truth with her lies, making it harder to fight back. "People are talking," she would say, pretending it wasn't her who spread the rumors. "Some of us are worried about safety." Safety. That word was poison when twisted like that. It painted the young woman and her dog as a threat when they were the ones being threatened. As the weeks passed, outside pressures crept in. The young woman was already juggling bills and doctor's visits, trying to keep her life balanced while carrying the weight of a condition that required her dog in the first place. The letters from the HOA piled on top of that, demanding fees for violations she hadn't committed. Her finances, already thin, stretched further until late nights were spent staring at numbers on a screen, wondering how much longer she could hold everything together. Stress carved itself into her face, into the way she moved. She smiled less, slept less, spoke less. Neighbors noticed, but they didn't act. Some pitied her, others kept their distance, worried that if they stepped in, the HOA queen would turn her eyes on them next. The silence of the community was its own kind of betrayal. Living there began to feel like being trapped in a glass box. Everyone could see, but no one would help. The woman in charge wasn't just driven by pettiness. Behind her polished smile and perfect house, there was something darker. Old resentments fueled her, the kind born out of a life where power was the only thing she could control. Her marriage was cold, her children gone, her days filled with routine she loathed. Running the HOA wasn't just a hobby, it was her throne. And the young woman with her dog represented everything she couldn't stand. Independence, vulnerability that wasn't weakness, and a quiet strength that resisted her dominance. Every encounter was a battle, whether spoken or not. The dog would stiffen whenever the woman appeared, sensing the hostility pulsing in the air. The young woman tried to keep her head down, but the attacks were relentless. Notes, comments, and meetings where her name was dragged through the mud. It was like a net closing in, thread by thread. And then came the turning point. One evening, as the young woman returned home with her dog, the HOA queen was waiting by her driveway. She didn't bother with a smile this time. Her voice was sharp, her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, she stepped closer than she ever had before. "That dog doesn't belong here," she hissed. "You don't belong here." The words cut deeper than all the notes combined. It was no longer about rules or violations. It was about erasing her. The young woman's chest tightened, but she stood her ground, her hand brushing against her dog's fur. She didn't reply, but silence only fueled the other woman's rage. The queen leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a whisper meant to pierce. "One way or another, I'll get rid of it." It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. And promises like that, in the hands of someone desperate for control, were dangerous. The stage was set. The balance of power had tilted too far, and there was no going back. Every look, every word, every false violation was building towards something explosive. The young woman could feel it in her bones. Her dog could sense it in its stillness. And the community, silent, complicit, waited for the storm they all knew was coming. It happened on a late afternoon, the kind of day when the sun hung low and stretched shadows across the neat lawns. The air was heavy, unmoving, as if the whole street was holding its breath. The young woman had just come back from a short walk with her dog, her steps slow from the weight of another restless night. The dog padded beside her, calm and focused, unaware of how quickly the air was about to shift. The HOA woman was waiting. She had been circling, watching, her presence lingering on the edge of the young woman's life until now. This time, she wasn't armed with notes or words alone. In her hand was a small canister, one she had pulled from her purse with a kind of satisfaction, like she had been rehearsing this moment for weeks. Pepper spray. She gripped it like a weapon, her nails digging into the metal, her breath sharp as she hid behind a mask of control. The confrontation unfolded fast. She stepped into the woman's path, blocking her from reaching her own front door. Her voice came out loud, shrill, carrying across the quiet street. "You think you can ignore me? You think that mutt makes you untouchable?" Spit flew from her lips, her face twisted in rage. The young woman froze, her body tense, the leash wrapped tight in her hand. Her dog pressed against her leg, sensing the danger. She opened her mouth to speak, to de-escalate, but the moment she took a breath, the spray hissed. A violent cloud burst forward, catching the dog across the face. The sound it made was sharp, heartbreaking, a choked yelp as it staggered, pawing at its burning eyes. Time seemed to fracture. The young woman's scream tore through the street, raw and desperate, echoing off the manicured houses that suddenly felt like cages. She dropped to her knees, clutching her dog, trying to shield it from further harm. The burn of chemicals stung her own eyes as the spray drifted in the air, catching her throat, making her cough. The HOA woman stood above them, her chest rising and falling, eyes wide with the thrill of control. For a split second, she looked almost satisfied, like this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she broke her target completely. But beneath that satisfaction was something darker, a flicker of panic. She realized she had crossed a line she couldn't take back. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the sound. Doors opened, voices rose, and eyes widened at the sight before them. The dog, stumbling blindly, whined in pain, the young woman clutching it with trembling arms. Her face was streaked with tears, part from the spray, part from pure devastation. She screamed at the woman standing above her, voice cracking with fury and grief. "You hurt my dog. You hurt my service dog." The street buzzed with confusion and full ear. Some neighbors stood frozen, unwilling to get involved. Others whispered to one another, their faces pale as they realized this wasn't just another HOA dispute. The woman who ruled over them with threats and rules had finally shown her true self. The HOA queen tried to regain her composure. "It's not what it looks like," she stammered, lowering the canister slightly. "The dog lunged at me. I was protecting myself." But her words fell flat. Everyone had seen the dog, gentle and trained, never aggressive. Her lie hung in the air, brittle and weak, while the reality of what she'd done burned into every watching eye. The young woman, shaking with rage, reached for her phone with one hand while holding her dog with the other. Her fingers slipped on the screen, but she managed to dial. Her voice, hoarse and broken, pleaded for help. "She sprayed my service dog. Please, he's hurt. Please hurry." The HOA woman's face shifted. Fear crept in, not of the neighbors or their whispers, but of what she suddenly realized she had triggered. This wasn't just an assault. This wasn't just another petty argument. It was a federal crime. The weight of that truth hit her as the sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Panic set in. She backed away, her hands trembling, the canister clattering against the pavement as it slipped from her grip. "It was an accident," she muttered, her voice uneven now, stripped of the authority she wore like armor. Her legs shook, but she forced herself to stand tall, desperate to maintain control in a situation that was already unraveling. The young woman rocked on the sidewalk, cradling her dog, whispering through sobs as if her words could ease the pain. "It's okay. I've got you. I've got you." Her entire body shook, but her grip never loosened. She looked up at the woman who had caused this, and for the first time, there was no fear in her eyes, only fury. The neighbors kept their distance, caught between shock and shame. They had watched the tension build for weeks, months even, but none of them had stepped in. Now, faced with the sight of a service dog writhing in pain, their silence felt like guilt pressing on their chests. The police arrived within minutes, lights flashing, sirens cutting through the thick evening air. Officers spilled out, scanning the scene with trained eyes. One of them knelt beside the young woman, calling for animal control and emergency veterinary support, while another turned to the HOA woman. Her excuses spilled out fast, words tumbling over one another. "It was self-defense. She came at me. The dog was aggressive. I didn't mean—" But her voice cracked with every denial. The officer didn't argue. He didn't need to. His hand rested on his belt, his expression sharp and unreadable. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "do you understand that assaulting a service animal is a federal offense?" The words landed like a hammer. The woman froze, her jaw dropping as the reality settled in. The color drained from her face. For years she had played with power, manipulated rules, twisted words to control people. But this was different. This wasn't her domain. This was the law, and it was bigger than her kingdom of neatly trimmed lawns and painted mailboxes. Her hands shook as officers guided her toward their car. The neighbors watched, some whispering, others standing silent. The sight of the once untouchable HOA queen, her wrists trembling, her eyes wide with disbelief, was almost surreal. For so long, she had been the one pulling the strings. Now she was just another person caught by her own cruelty. The immediate aftermath was chaos layered with silence. The dog was rushed away, the young woman following close, her face streaked with tears and spray burns. Neighbors slowly drifted back into their homes, their perfect lawns and houses suddenly suffocating. The image of the dog's pain, the young woman's screams, and the HOA queen's frozen expression lingered in the air long after the flashing lights were gone. For the young woman, the adrenaline wouldn't let go. Her hands shook long into the night, her chest tight, her thoughts a storm of fear and rage. Every second replayed in her mind, the hiss of the spray, the yelp, the laughter, the sudden silence. She couldn't unsee it, couldn't unhear it, and she couldn't shake the truth, that her life had been forever altered by a woman who had decided her power mattered more than someone else's survival. For the HOA woman, denial became her shield. Sitting in the back of the police car, the metal biting into her wrists, she clung to the belief that she could talk her way out, just like she always had. But the look on the officer's face, the words "federal crime" ringing in her ears, told her that this time was different. This time, her kingdom had fallen. And for the neighborhood, the silence that returned afterward wasn't the same as before. It wasn't neat or watchful. It was heavy. Everyone knew they had watched a storm build and chosen to stay quiet until it was too late. That silence was now a reminder that power, left unchecked, always takes something precious before it finally breaks. The flashing lights faded, but the echoes of that night stayed behind like a stain no one could scrub out. The neighborhood that once prided itself on order and quiet now carried a different kind of silence, one heavy with shame, whispers and avoidance. Doors that once opened easily now closed faster. Neighbors who once nodded at each other in passing kept their heads down, unwilling to meet one another's eyes. They all knew what they had seen. They all knew what they hadn't done. For the young woman, the days that followed blurred together. She barely slept, her body still trembling from the shock. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the moment again, the burst of spray, the yelp of her dog, the laughter that turned into silence. Her service Dinez survived, but the burns to its eyes and the trauma left behind meant long vet visits, sleepless nights, and a gnawing fear that it would never be the same. She sat for hours beside her dog's bed, stroking its fur, whispering apologies she didn't need to make but couldn't stop saying. The dog had been her strength, her safety net. Seeing it hurt because of her enemy's hatred carved a wound deeper than anything she could describe. Her own body bore the marks too. Her throat burned for days, her eyes swollen, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional one. She felt stripped of safety, of dignity. The street where she once walked freely now felt hostile, every corner reminding her of the moment she lost control of her own world. The legal process began quickly. Officers had seen enough, neighbors had testified, and the evidence was clear. The HOA woman had crossed a line that even she couldn't twist back in her favor. But denial clung to her like perfume. At the police station, she insisted it was self-defense, her voice breaking as she spun the story. She painted herself as the victim, claiming she had been intimidated, provoked, and cornered. The officers listened, but their faces remained blank, their reports filled with the details that mattered. A service dog attacked without reason, a woman blinded by cruelty, witnesses who confirmed the truth. In the days after, her house became a fortress. Curtains stayed closed, and the once perfect lawn grew patches of neglect. Neighbors who had once feared her began to talk freely, their whispers no longer restrained. Old grievances surfaced, stories of her intimidation, her manipulation, her reign over the HOA. One by one, they admitted they had seen pieces of her cruelty, but none had spoken up. Now, with her mugshot printed in local papers and her name circling online, their silence weighed heavier than ever. The community fractured. Some tried to distance themselves, insisting they had never supported her, never agreed with her actions. Others wrestled with guilt, admitting they had enabled her simply by keeping quiet. A few even tried to justify her behavior, saying stress or loneliness had driven her too far. But most knew the truth. She had always enjoyed her power. The crime hadn't been an accident. It was the climax of years of control boiling over. For her family, the fallout was crushing. Her husband, who had long tolerated her dominance in private, could no longer avoid the weight of her actions. Friends they once shared cut ties quickly, unwilling to be associated with someone branded as cruel enough to harm a service animal. Her chills, Dren, grown and distant, refused to speak to her, ashamed of the headlines that plastered her face across screens. She was no longer the respected woman of the HOA. She was a criminal, mocked, despised, and ridiculed beyond repair. Meanwhile, the young woman who had lived quietly and endured so much found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight. Reporters called, articles were written, and suddenly her pain became public. Strangers online sent messages of support. Donations poured in for her dog's medical care, and people she'd never met praised her strength. Yet every headline also reminded her of the violence she'd survived. She hadn't wanted attention. She had wanted peace. Now her story was out of her hands, dissected by people who didn't know her but felt entitled to her suffering. The psychological toll settled in slowly, heavier each day. Nights were the hardest. She would jolt awake at the faintest sound, convinced someone was at her door. Her chest tightened whenever she walked her dog, her eyes darting at every shadow. Therapy sessions became a necessity, not a choice. She spoke through tears, trying to explain the helplessness of having her lifeline attacked in broad daylight. Her therapist told her she was suffering from trauma, that her body was replaying the danger even when she was safe. But safe no longer felt like something she could have. For the HOA woman, jail was a reality she never thought she'd face. Her arrogance clashed with fear as she sat in a cell, stripped of the control she had once wielded so easily. She replayed the moment again and again, convincing herself she hadn't meant for it to go that far, that she had only wanted to scare the dog, not truly harm it. But deep down, in the corners of her mind, she couldn't silence. She knew it had been intentional. It had been about power. She had wanted to prove she could break the young woman's world, and now she was the one broken. Public opinion was brutal. Online forums tore her apart. Neighbors who once feared her spoke freely about her tyranny, and even strangers weighed in, calling her a monster. The image she had built of herself as a respectable figure, a leader, collapsed overnight. No one cared about her excuses. No one believed her cries of being misunderstood. She wasn't the queen of her perfect street anymore. She was a cautionary tale. The ripple effect stretched far beyond the two women. The community board, once silent and complicit, faced scrutiny of its own. Residents questioned why no one had reined her in, why her reign of intimidation had been allowed to grow unchecked. Meetings became heated, voices once muted now loud with anger. People who had been too afraid to speak before demanded change. Her downfall became a mirror, forcing the neighborhood to see its own cowardice. Yet for all the noise, the young woman was left in the quiet of her own pain. She didn't care about the HOA board, the gossip, or the fall of the woman who had tormented her. All she cared about was her dog, the one constant in her life, now scarred but still by her side. She spent her evenings sitting close to it, whispering gratitude, reminding herself that, despite everything, they had survived. But survival came at a cost. The neighborhood that had once been her home no longer felt livable. Every corner reminded her of cruelty, of silence, of betrayal. She began to think of leaving, of starting over somewhere far away where the lawns weren't so neat and the people didn't pretend perfection while hiding poison underneath. In the end, the aftermath wasn't just about a crime. It was about what happens when cruelty goes unchecked, when silence gives power to the wrong people, when a single act shatters the illusion of order. For the young woman, it meant scars and strength she never wanted to earn. For the HOA woman, it meant a fall so hard that she would never recover her name. And for the neighborhood, it meant living every day with the knowledge that they had watched it all build, and they had done nothing until it was too late. The case closed in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old wood and cold air, a place where the weight of truth pressed down heavier than anywhere else. The HOA woman sat at the defense table, her face pale, her hands folded tight as if she could hold together the pieces of her crumbling life. Gone was the confidence that had once draped her like a second skin. In its place was something raw, fear, shame, and a deep disbelief that her reign had ended like this. Across the room, the young woman sat with her service dog resting at her feet. The dog's eyes were scarred but steady, a living reminder of both pain and survival. The verdict was clear. The law did not see shades of grey in the attack on a service animal. It was a federal crime, and the sentence carried weight. Months of hearings and arguments ended with the HOA woman being led away in handcuffs, her once pristine reputation reduced to a headline that people whispered about but no longer feared. She had been stripped of power in the most public way possible. For her, the punishment was more than prison time. It was the humiliation of being remembered not as a leader, not as a neighbor, but as the woman who broke the law out of cruelty and control. For the young woman, justice came, but it was not clean. Court victories do not erase trauma, nor do they heal the cracks left behind in the quiet moments. She still woke up some nights with her chest tight, the memory of spray burning her lungs. She still flinched at sudden sounds, her trust in neighbors shattered. But she carried herself differently now. The court had listened, the truth had been seen, and for once, power had been wrestled from the hands of someone who had misused it. Survival was its own kind of justice, even if scars lingered. Her service dog, though changed, remained her anchor. Its training and loyalty never faltered, even after the attack. The bond between them deepened in ways words couldn't capture. Each walk they took after the trial was both an act of defiance and healing. Every step said, "We are still here." The neighborhood, once polished and proud, never fully recovered. The perfect lawns and carefully painted mailboxes now stood as reminders of complicity. People avoided speaking of the crime, but their silence spoke louder than any words. The HOA restructured, new leaders rose, and meetings were filled with nervous attempts to prove that the past would never repeat itself. Yet the truth lingered. They had let power grow unchecked, and someone innocent had suffered for it. Their collective guilt settled like dust in every corner of that street. For the HOA woman, prison stripped away everything she had clung to. Friends abandoned her, her family refused her calls, and the walls that surrounded her each night reminded her that her power had always been fragile. She told herself stories to survive, that it had been an accident, that she had been misunderstood, that the punishment was too harsh. But deep down, the silence of her cell forced her to face the truth she had tried to outrun. She had chosen cruelty, and cruelty had destroyed her. Public backlash went beyond her name. Her case became a cautionary tale, splashed across news sites, dissected in opinion columns, and debated online. People who had never set foot in her neighborhood spoke about the arrogance of HOAs, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the importance of protecting service animals. Strangers rallied to support the young woman, donations covering vet bills and legal fees, letters of encouragement arriving from people she would never meet. The crime, as brutal as it was, sparked conversations that stretched far beyond one community, and yet, for those closest, the bigger questions cut deeper. Was justice truly served? Yes, the law had punished the act, but the scars remained, emotional, physical, and communal. No verdict could restore trust between neighbors or undo the trauma of hearing a dog scream in pain. Justice, in its truest sense, felt complicated. It held victory and loss in the same hand. The story forced a reflection on human behavior, the fragile line between control and cruelty, between authority and abuse. The HOA woman had not acted out of necessity. She had acted out of a need to dominate. That desire to hold power, to bend others to her will, had consumed her until she crossed a line she could never retreat from. Her downfall revealed how destructive unchecked power can be, even in places as ordinary as quiet suburban streets. For the young woman, the journey was about more than survival. It was about reclaiming her place in a world that had tried to push her out. She learned that silence does not protect, that speaking the truth, even through pain, can strip away the masks people hide behind. Her strength did not come from anger alone. It came from endurance, from the refusal to let cruelty define her. On a broader level, the crime highlighted cracks in the way society views vulnerability and control. Service animals are lifelines, not pets, and yet their importance is still misunderstood. Communities, meant to protect and support, too often enable bullies in positions of authority. The case revealed that when silence becomes the norm, cruelty thrives. It was a reminder that morality is not tested in moments of comfort, but in the decisions people make when standing up for someone else could come at a cost. As time passed, the young woman chose to leave the neighborhood. She packed her belongings, loaded her car, and with her dog beside her, drove away from the manicured streets that had once felt like a trap. She found a new place, smaller, quieter, without an HOA breathing down her neck. For the first time in a long time, the air around her felt free. The HOA woman remained behind bars, her world reduced to grey walls and cold meals. She was forgotten by most, remembered only when her name appeared in articles as a warning. She had lost everything: status, family, freedom, all for a moment of cruelty that had lasted seconds but defined the rest of her life. The neighborhood learned to live with its silence, though it was a different kind now. Not the controlled, watchful silence of perfection, but the heavy silence of shame. Some tried to make amends, others moved away, but the story stayed with them. It was the kind of event that stained a place forever. In the end, the story was about more than a crime. It was about the fragility of power, the strength of resilience, and the cost of silence. It was about how cruelty reveals itself not in grand gestures, but in small, persistent choices that escalate until they break lives apart. And it was about justice. Not perfect, not clean, but necessary. The young woman never wanted to be the center of attention, but her story carried weight because it revealed something unspoken, that beneath the polished surfaces of society, darker truths exist. Power corrupts when unchecked. Vulnerability should never be mocked. And silence, when chosen over action, can be just as dangerous as cruelty itself.